We'll get started now with a quick introduction of our panel. Jon Roberts, immediately to my right, is Tomorrow Foundation Professor of History at Boston University. And he will be taking us back to the 19th century and giving us a survey of how, an overview of science and its meaning in 19th century America.
It is a great pleasure to be here. I was telling a couple of the panelists before we started that I never fail to be in awe of the adults in the Boston area. Here we are at 7 o'clock on a Thursday evening talking about something that could be perceived, I guess, to be somewhat esoteric, science in the 19th century. Now, I know why we're here, but you're here. And that's, I think, really impressive to most of us. And it's a real tribute to the intellectual interest that Bostonians have that a panel like this can attract this kind of crowd. As Jonathan indicated in his introduction, I've been charged with the task of providing an overview of the development of 19th century science and its place in American cultural and intellectual life. All right, let me begin by noting that among the most conspicuous changes that occurred within American culture in the 19th century were an increasing use of the term science within the public arena and the emergence of a sometimes rather heated controversy concerning what should be included within the purview of that term. Prior to the 1830s, the term science typically retained the meaning that it had acquired back in the medieval period. That is to say, science was characteristically used as a synonym for accurate, systematic knowledge of all kinds. In this context, for example, theology was often referred to as the queen of the sciences. We obviously don't think of it as a science today, but at the time it was viewed as the queen of the sciences. The terms that were most frequently used to describe what we think of when we think of science today was not science, but natural history, and even more frequently, natural philosophy. In addition, practitioners of natural history and natural philosophy were, when they were referred to as people of science at all, were typically referred to as men of science. There were some women who did science, but the common phrase was men of science. In fact, the term scientist wasn't even coined until 1834. Well, accompanying these terminological changes, the emergence of the term science was a good deal of controversy concerning the fields of inquiry that deserve to be called sciences. During the course of the 19th century, Americans typically held that science involved systematic knowledge, knowledge arrived at through a critical evaluation of empirical evidence, but they increasingly limited the scope of science to those disciplines that engaged in the study of material entities and physical processes. As it happened, and as you can probably imagine, many Americans deplored this tendency to narrow the meaning of science in that fashion. In 1867, for example, an eminent American philologist by the name of William Dwight Whitney denounced what he called, and I'm quoting Whitney here, a growing disposition to restrict the honorable title of science to those departments of knowledge which are founded on the unvarying laws of material nature. A few years later, the theologically conservative Princeton theologian Charles Hodge similarly complained that the term science was commonly seen as, in Hodge's words, restricted to the knowledge of a particular class of facts and of their relations, namely the facts of nature or of the external world. For his part, Hodge, even in the 1870s, was intent on describing theology as a science on the grounds that it took on the task of arranging biblical data in a systematic manner. It's in this context of controversy concerning the appropriate meaning of the term science, I think, that we can place the claim of Mary Baker Eddy and a number of other proponents of mental healing that their positions rightly deserve to be considered as science. Eddy endorsed a more or less classical view of the meaning of science and held that science, rightly conceived, simply referred to genuine knowledge and pure truth. And from that perspective, she concluded that the term science should be applied to what she called, and I'm quoting Mary Baker Eddy here, the laws of God and his government of the universe, inclusive of man. In addition, Mary Baker Eddy insisted that her views qualified as science because the truth of the claims that she was making could be established through an appeal to empirical evidence, the empirical evidence of people's bodies that had been healed through her methods. And so she said, why shouldn't we call this science as well? It is, after all, based on empirical evidence. Well, during the 19th century, discussions of the appropriate meaning of science were accompanied by important changes in the norms of scientific explanation and discourse within the realms of the natural sciences themselves. To explain what I mean by this, I should probably begin by noting that prior to about 1750, discussion of the natural world had been inextricably bound up with discourse about God. Rarely was the natural world discussed by natural philosophers or natural historians without, in one way or another, invoking the Creator. To be sure, even in the so-called early modern period, natural historians and natural philosophers did manage to describe some natural phenomena in terms of so-called secondary agencies and natural laws. And yet, during that period, few of those practitioners of science expressed any qualms at all at invoking the supernatural whenever they were unable to account for natural phenomena in terms of natural processes. Now, in truth, even after 1750, scientists continued on occasion to ascribe events that occurred within the natural world to the agency of God. Let me cite just one very notable example. In 1859, Charles Darwin could write of what he called, and I'm quoting Darwin here, laws impressed on matter by the Creator, Creator with a capital C, without seeming to violate recognizable canons of scientific discourse. With that said, though, it's still the case that during the period after 1750, scientists in one field after another began to make ever more concerted efforts to establish a new principle. The principle that, as one natural historian put it, it is the aim of science to narrow the domain of the supernatural by bringing all phenomena within the scope of natural laws and secondary causes. Now, it's important to understand, I think, that the majority of scientists, the majority of natural scientists in the 19th century, did not regard this commitment to restrict their discourse to naturalistic agencies as in any respect a denial of the existence of God. Most natural scientists in the 19th century were fervent believers. So what's at issue here is not belief in the existence of God. Instead, scientists simply regarded their decision to restrict discourse to naturalistic methods as a methodological principle for the practice of science.